So it's another beautiful day in these mountains, and I'm going to try to capture it with a painting. And I'm going to use Inktense pencils on Yupo paper, which is kind of a hard thing to do, but kind of a fun thing to do too. Let's get started. This is the scene that I want to paint, so I set up my easel with a simple clipboard attached to a tripod. I taped some Yupo paper to the clipboard and started to draw on it. Yupo is a plastic-based paper, and it's super slippery and not absorbent at all. I haven't used this surface a lot up until this point, just a few experiments at home. It's kind of a difficult paper to use, but if you can put up with its shortcomings, it's also really fun. I'm starting out this painting with a quick sketch with regular color pencils to kind of get the basic composition down. I use the regular color pencils first because they would be less likely to wash away once I add water. You'll see in a bit how water really moves things around on this paper. The regular color pencils do stay put, but even they can be easily removed with some scrubbing. Here I used a couple of different colors, sort of as a way to take some color notes of what I'm seeing. But like I said in the intro to this video, I'll be using Inktense pencils for most of this. Inktense pencils are water-soluble pencils that have a really vibrant pigment, and that is the pencil I'm using now. I'm scribbling in the colors really loosely to start. I'm not really worried about the marks I'm making yet, because the water is really going to blend them out, almost to a fault, especially if you use too much water, which is why you'll see that I squeeze out most of the water from the brush with my fingers. I don't think I would recommend using Yupo paper to a beginner, unless you're really in the mood to experiment, because things can get out of control really quickly. But I like experimenting and exploring new art supplies, so this is kind of fun for me, even though there will be plenty of frustrations along the way. I didn't put a lot of Inktense down, so it blended away quite a bit. If you want a darker color, you'll need to lay down more Inktense to start with. I'm not sure why I didn't do that, other than I kind of get in a hurry to block things in and get rid of the white of the paper. You can add new layers though, which is what I'm doing now to try to darken that sky, but you'll see that it doesn't necessarily leave the bottom layer alone. So while I'm adding pigment, it really isn't layering on top like regular paper does. Instead, it just is kind of blending together. It's truly a unique surface that is kind of hard to figure out. But I'll press on. The sky is pretty light anyway. The water just kind of sits on top of this plastic paper and never really absorbs. And it's not really that hot out here, so it isn't evaporating too fast either. But that's okay, because I'm able to go back with the Inktense into the water that is already on the paper, and that lays down really vibrantly, which is great for putting in those trees with some darker colors. This is maybe my favorite technique so far with this paper. Getting the paper somewhat wet first and then dropping in the Inktense pencil in second. It moves around a bit, but not too much. It just kind of makes an impressionistic mark, and a darker one too. For this steep riverbank, I want it to be fairly dark, so I'm going to add more pigment. And even though my brush isn't very damp, and I'm dabbing more than wiping, the pigment dilutes pretty quickly. One of the problems is the brush that I'm using. It's kind of picking up the pigment and the water off the paper. So I'm kind of fighting with my brush too. Water wants to go where it's drier. So if the paper is wetter than the brush, the water will soak up into the brush. If the paper is drier than the brush, the water and the pigment will stay on the paper. So I'm using that to my advantage a bit by adding some marks with the brush to other areas of the paper that are a bit more dry by now. It's kind of a dance, and many people say that when painting on Yupo paper, you just kind of let things happen, because it's truly difficult to control. And I'm not saying I'm an expert at this by any means. I'm just showing you what does and doesn't work. I like the way the pencil lays on thickly when the paper is wet, but I don't really like how quickly it blends away. I think I would probably have better luck with a different brush. I'm using a pretty big brush because I'm still in the phase of getting the bigger shapes and the overall compositional feel. The bigger brush keeps me from getting too precious with my mark making. There'll be plenty of time for that in a later stage when I use a different brush. With regular watercolor paper, building up one layer at a time is typically the way to go. It's proving to be difficult with this paper, and I truly am learning what works and doesn't work as I go here. Lots of mistakes, frankly. But it's fun experimenting with this, and I like the abstract way the colors fall on the paper, and I like seeing how the different colors are blending with each other. Here I'm trying to get some interesting fluid textures in that stream. It's a beautiful day out here, and I do like being outside. Painting outside isn't easy though, but it is a great way of getting to see the landscape in a deeper way than what a photo can do. And even though it isn't easy, it's kind of relaxing, if that makes any sense. Mostly because I'm not really worried about making a great painting out here, because I know that I can always fix it when I get home. And I will be finishing this painting up at home. But being out here and observing and recording the impression of what I see in the scene will stay in my mind, and I'll compare my memory with what I see in the reference photos that I'll take before I leave. For now, I'm just getting a mostly abstract underpainting that I'll build upon later. That water in the river is more gold looking than you might think, so I'm adding in that now. And the trees in the background are darker than they appear here, but I'm starting to overwork the painting and the colors are blending too much together and it's getting muddy looking. Plus the sun is moving quickly, and as it gets more overhead, it's getting too bright to work. So I need to get out of here, but first I'll get plenty of photos so that I can look at them later too at home. I'm hoping that I can finish this up in the way I envision. When I set up at home, I decided that I needed to make that river a bit darker to accentuate that island. Since the paper was fully dry at this point, the Inktense went on as normal, and not the same as when the paper was wet. When I did wet it, I used a fairly dry bristle brush, but all of the previous textures I got outside were wiped away. Oh well, you live and learn. I tried to get some of the ripples back in and did an okay job. The wet brush will spread the pigment, and as the brush dries, it will start to lift it out. With some pigment left on the brush, I was able to get some of the textures back for the bushes and the trees. But I'm quickly learning the limitations of Yupo paper and water-soluble pencils. You can only go so far with it. Remembering that I started out the painting with regular colored pencils and seeing that the water didn't move them as much, I decided to go ahead and finish the painting with the non-water soluble pencils on top of the Inktense underpainting. You can use Inktense dry for this, but the color pencils were a bit more opaque, so I used them instead. The pencils worked okay, and it was easier to get some of the details, but it is still pretty muddy looking and too dark in many places. But a great thing about Yupo is that I can wipe off and erase mistakes very easily. Saving the whites of the rocks and the ripples in the water wasn't a mistake. I knew from previous practice sessions that I'd be able to erase them with ease. So I did. Using a battery-powered eraser is a very quick way to get back to the white of the paper. And since the Yupo paper is basically plastic, you don't have to worry about ripping or tearing with too much pressure. The only difficult thing is controlling the marks. But even then, you can always go back over it with pencil where needed. I did that with the shadows and the different colors. It's one of my favorite things about the paper. It's easy to start over. With the white marks, the painting is starting to get some sparkle back. I like that. I added some highlights in the trees and bushes too. And where needed, I used the pencil to touch it up. So there you have it. Inktense and colored pencil on Yupo paper. I liked what I learned, and I hope to keep improving on future paintings. Be sure to subscribe to see future experiments with this paper and other papers. Thanks for exploring art with me.